The following is an AI-generated reading of Parts 3 and 4 of Junk Bonds and Corporate Raiders, Academe in the Hour of the Wolf by Camille Paglia, 1992. It is a review of the two 1990 books, 100 Years of Homosexuality by David M. Halperin, and The Constraints of Desire, The Anthropology of Sex and Gender in Ancient Greece by John J. Winkler. The paper is, in part, a response to Martha Nussbaum's review of the same two books published in Times Literary Supplement, June 1990. Part 3. The current crisis in the humanities has been misinterpreted by both sides in the debate. We are feeling the impact of two developments of the late 19th century. First, the birth of American graduate education in a departmental structure artificially broken down and separated into national literatures, and, secondly, the secularization of faculties, who had earlier emerged from divinity schools. German historicism, inspired by an ideal of scientific objectivity, made the latter development possible. It also drove an opening wedge between American higher education and Protestantism, the dominant code, conveniently at the moment of the first waves of Catholic and Jewish immigrants who would transform American life. Secularization was never fully achieved. It lingered, I submit, even in the new criticism, which as a college student in the 60s I felt as suffocatingly Protestant in its style and assumptions. Secularization is a welcome process if it allows us to analyze literature and art without moral preconception and sermonizing. But secularization is pernicious when it strips the spiritual dimension from experience. Today's crisis is really a chaos. Both the rigorous learning of German philology and the practical discipline of new criticism have been cast aside for an ill-understood French style of grand, self-referential, pseudo-philosophical speculation, which no American critic does well. The number one problem today is not ignorant students, but ignorant professors, who have substituted narrow, quote, expertise and theoretical sophistication, a preposterous term, for breadth and depth of learning in the world history of art and thought. The idea of expertise in any one area of the humanities, with its subsequent phenomenon of faculty recruitment by time, framed, quote, slots, was always mistaken. It was inspired in this masculine pioneer country that has never taken the arts seriously, by nervous emulation of the sciences, where one can indeed deeply and profitably specialize in moths, ferns, or igneous rocks. But there is no true expertise in the humanities without knowing all of the humanities. Art is a vast, ancient, interconnected webwork, a fabricated tradition. Over-concentration on any one point is a distortion. This is one of the primary reasons for the dullness and ineptitude of so much 20th century criticism as compared to 19th century belles lettres. American professors have been institutionally impelled by graduate education and then by the universities that employ them to become narrower and narrower. The goal of comprehensive cultural vision, predicated by German philology, which esteemed universal scholarship, has been dismissed as unrealistic in a modern, alienated world of fragmentation and subjectivity. But the old German style, sober, practical, precise, lucid, and learned, is exactly what is needed to remedy today's confusions and excesses. Only small minds fail to see patterns and holes. Both undergraduate education and commentary on the arts require teachers and scholars who understand the history of civilization in broad, general terms. Hollywood Bible movies of the 50s, like the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, with their epic clash of pagan and Judeo-Christian cultures, tell more truth about art and society than the French infatuated ideologues who have made a travesty of the, quote, best, American higher education. New criticism was not the total rebellion against German research it at first seemed to be. In its analysis of the structure and aesthetic principles of a text, it was simply applying the empirical method of systematic investigation to the inner life of a work imagined as a self-sufficient mechanism. One of the recent leftist libels about the new critics is that they were obsessed hunters of irony and paradox, a charge far more accurate about the febrile word-chopping school of Derrida. Alas, most new criticism was deadly earnest in the Protestant way. The strength of new criticism was that it was formulated by poets, men of cultivation and sensibility and, something conveniently forgotten today, broad mastery of the classics and literary history, including the Bible. The weakness of new criticism was its agrarian Rousseauism, which suffused its artistic psychology with a sunny benevolence and made it stubbornly resistant to the darker, more turbulent, and conflict-based system of Freud. On the other hand, the closeness of the Southern new critics to the land kept them attuned to universal archetypal imagery of nature, which has been banished from the French social constructionist worldview. The new criticism was a superb instrument for the up-close study of literature, in its word-by-word revelation of the power and complexity of language. It remains unsurpassed for introductory classroom instruction and for teaching people how to think and write. Its absence in France explains much of the current French clumsiness with historical and literary documents, which are manhandled and misread with solipsistic, drunken abandon. The major problem with new criticism is that it cannot stand alone as an approach to art. It needs to be supplemented by historical learning and by training in larger schemes of conceptual reasoning. The present crisis in the humanities originated in the post-war English department, which was and is a parochial construction. The folly was in thinking that you could make critics by training them just in criticism. Criticism without learning is futile. It produces lightweights, posers, triflers. Only poets can practice ad-lib criticism out of their own originality and definitiveness of imagination. The rapid expansion of universities in the baby boom era and the invention of the 4-year PhD, a disastrous move that devalued the doctorate and substituted hasty, pretentious, assembly line-made work for true research and learning, institutionalized the worst features of second-generation new criticism. The 50s English department as a genteel, hermetic echo chamber can still be felt in the work of Helen Vendler, for whom the world began with Chaucer and ended with Wallace Stevens. The puritanical moralism of middle-brow new criticism is illustrated by the way Vendler's 1975 book on George Herbert exiled all references to sex, to the footnotes, to the periphery of the permissible. The sex problem of new criticism would come crashing back upon it. One reason for the incoherence and mediocrity of women's studies is that so many of its leaders, Ellen Moores, Carolyn Heilbrunn, Sandra Gilbert, Susan Gubar, Elaine Showalter, were produced by the 50s English department and so never had an ounce of preparation for social and historical inquiry, much less the most rudimentary knowledge of psychology and sexology. Moreover, these academic feminists, unlike Vendler, aren't even good critics in Mamie Eisenhower-era terms and seem to have drifted into women's studies by default after failing in aesthetic analysis. One of the biggest scams of contemporary education is the way these conventional married women who never rocked a boat in their life ripped off and sanitized the ideas of my fractious generation of the 60s and turned them into profitable public careers. The new criticism had to go, or rather, it had to be absorbed and transformed. It was an American style, and there was an American solution to its problems. I will argue that the French invasion of academe in the 70s was not at all a continuation of the 60s revolution, but rather an evasion of it. In Tenured Radicals, which treats trendy, showboating professors with the irreverence they deserve, Roger Kimball makes one statement I would correct. He suggests the radicals of the 60s are now in positions of control in the major universities. He is too generous. Most of America's academic leftists are no more radical than my Aunt Hattie. 60s radicals rarely went on to graduate school. If they did, they often dropped out. If they made it through, they had trouble getting a job and keeping it. They remain mavericks, isolated, off-center. Today's academic leftists are strutting wannabes, timorous nerds who missed the 60s while they were grade-grubbing in the library and brown-nosing the senior faculty. Their politics came to them late, second-hand, and special delivery via the Parisian import craze of the 70s. These people have risen to the top not by challenging the system, but by smoothly adapting themselves to it. Their company men, Rosencrantz and Guildensterns, privileged opportunists who rode the wave of fashion. Most true 60s people could not, and largely did not survive in the stifling graduate schools of the late 60s and early 70s. The followers of Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault, far from being political and intellectual sophisticates, are the real fossilized reactionaries of our time. They seized on and dogged to death ideas that were totally passé in America well before 1970. Foucault spoke of Beckett's Waiting for Godot as the pivotal, liberating experience of his generation of Parisians, emerging from existentialism. When I saw that play in 1966 in college, I recognized it as a repressive anxiety formation of defunct modernism, which the 60s revolution, energized by rock, had swept completely away. At that moment in America, popular culture, rude, vital, brassy, had triumphed. Warhol and Oldenburg, reanimating the commercial motifs of our daily life, had killed the European avant-garde forever. The spiritual history of the 60s has yet to be written. Psychedelia, a profound reordering of Western perception, lost its documenters, who blew their brains out on acid. Elvis Presley, one of the most influential men of the century, broke down racial barriers in the music industry so that my generation was flooded by the power, passion, and emotional truth of African American experience. Aretha Franklin, Levi Stubbs, James Brown, Gladys Knight. These voices and 100 others are seared into our consciousness. Black artists are the American paradigm of vivid, vibrant personality, dramatic self-assertion, and spiritual magnitude of the individual voice. By what retrograde, lace curtain shrinking from reality did our academics look to spinsterish French notions of the, quote, decentered subject? Of course the French felt decentered. They'd just been crushed by Germany. American GIs, including my uncles, got shot up rescuing France when she was lying flat on her face under the Nazi boot. Hence it is revolting to see pampered American academics down on their knees kissing French bums. Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault are the perfect prophets for the weak, anxious academic personality, trapped in verbal formulas and perennially defeated by circumstance. They offer a self-exculpating cosmic explanation for the normal professorial state of resentment, alienation, dithery, passivity, and inaction. Their popularity illustrates the psychological gap between professors and students that has damaged so much undergraduate education. The disciples of Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault are ignorant of 19th century intellectual history, which originated and developed their arguments, and ignorant of America, which leapt far beyond European thought from the moment we invented Hollywood. Specifically, the French school of the 70s was crashingly irrelevant to America's internal political dynamic. We already had a major theorist, greater than all the post-war French after Sartre, Norman O. Brown. In Life Against Death, 1959, and Love's Body, 1966, the deeply learned and classically trained Brown made an unsurpassed fusion of literature, philosophy, psychoanalysis, history, and politics. His two books had a spectacular impact on the American 60s. At the same time were released in paperback the 4 volumes of The Social History of Art by the Marxist Arnold Hauser, a scholar of staggering erudition and brilliant precision in the German style. It was because of Brown and Hauser that Foucault seemed to me, from the moment I first saw his work in 1971, an absolute ninny. But my generation was condemned to live out what was only imagined by the older Norman O. Brown. We put the myth of Dionysus into action, and we hit the wall of reality. The 60s revolutionized consciousness, but on the road of excess, by which we sought the palace of wisdom, many of us lost our minds, lives, or careers through drugs, sexual orgy, or, my vice, constant challenges to authority. The 60s, rebelling against 50s bourgeois conformity and respectability, took life to its extreme and explored the far edges of the possible. Altamont, December 1969, was our Waterloo. There, the Dionysian forces released by the 60s showed their ugly face. The film Gimme Shelter documents that turbulent day when the Hells Angels beat people with pool cues, when the Rolling Stones presided over a murder before the stage, when Grace Slick could not calm a surging crowd moaning and sighing with Dantean inner torment. Moon in Scorpio. Altamont was the end of 60s illusions about the benevolence of human nature and Mother Nature. In America, we made a rapid transit from the ideal to the real, that motif of disillusionment of the 19th century novel. Everyone who honestly explored 60s ideals eventually had to confront the limitations of those ideals. Risk and loss, often permanent, were the price of discovery. What is outrageous in the French fad is that a grotesque head trip was imposed on us, who had learned our own lessons in our own way. France is a prisoner of its history and high culture. It had no mammoth popular culture like ours. Its brief student revolt flickered and failed. Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault are virtuoso wordsmiths without historical or political expertise, even in their own country. Their American popularity has been an asinine episode in the musty academic chronicles. In the 60s, amid the cloistered sterility of late new criticism, we vowed, never again. Never again abstractions that kill art. Never again the mind divorced from the body, or the mind divorced from emotion. The 70s, French fad, was a flight from 60s truths, a reactionary escape into false abstraction and rationalism, masquerading as distrust of reason. Last year, I attended a lecture at the University of Pennsylvania, given by a prominent visiting Ivy League feminist. It was a dreadful experience, and I'm afraid I behaved rather badly. A small, frail, drably dressed, but obviously very nice woman with a pale voice showed slide after slide of gorgeous ads and pictorials from fashion magazines and proceeded to demolish them with an ugly, ponderous, aggressive, labyrinthine Lacan machinery that surely not 3 people in the audience fully understood. Brutal language of mutilation, decapitation, strangulation, bondage, and enslavement filled the air. I began to writhe in my seat with pain. I could not stifle, to the annoyance of my neighbors, muttered cries of, "Oh, awful," and "give me a break." At the end, I waved my arms around and made an agitated speech, most graciously tolerated by the lecturer, denouncing the feminist inability to deal with beauty and pleasure. to which gay men have made such outstanding cultural contributions. Every young woman in the audience, intimidated by incomprehension into thinking she was hearing something brilliant, was intellectually oppressed by that lecture and that approach to life and thought. Lacan is a tyrant who must be driven from our shores. Narrowly trained English professors who know nothing of art history or popular culture think they can just wade in with Lacan and trash everything in sight. As I later wrote to the series sponsor, if the lecturer had done the same thing to, say, African art cutting into a tradition without any regard for its history, methods, or iconography, a lynch mob would have formed. I now realize how lucky I was, in the total absence of role models, to have only men to rebel against. Today's women students are meeting their oppressors in dangerously seductive new form, as successful, congenial female professors who are themselves victims of a rigid foreign ideology. Let's dump the French in Boston Harbor and let them swim home. Robert Casario recently said to me, quote, "The whole profession has become a vast mimicry. The idea that there is open debate is an absolute fiction. There is only the Foucault monologue, the Lacan monologue, the Derrida monologue. There is no room for creative disagreement. No deviation from what is approved is tolerated." End quote. These monologues are really one, the monotonous drone of the school of Saussure, which has cast its delusional inky cloud over modern academic thought. Never have so many been so wrong about so much. It is positively idiotic to imagine that there is no experience outside of language. I am in love with language, but never for a moment did I dream that language encompasses and determines all knowledge. It has been a truism of basic science courses for decades in America that the brain has multiple areas of function, and that language belongs only to specific areas, injured by trauma and restored by surgery or speech therapy. For thousands of years, sages and mystics of both East and West have taught us about the limitations of language in seeking truth. When Dante must part from Virgil at the gates of paradise, he is expressing the ancient insight that faith and vision occur in a realm beyond reason and language. My generation, inheriting the beatnik's interest in Zen, made a spiritual passage to India, with its flaming avatars. We knew words, names, concepts had to be dissolved and transcended. Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault are termites compared to the art, culture, and archaic topography of India. One remedy for today's educational impasse: more India and less France. The followers of Derrida are pathetic, snuffling in French pockets for bits and pieces of a deconstructive method already massively and coherently presented, and with a mature sense of the sacred in Buddhism and Hinduism. The American academics who went bananas over Gallic theory were callow 90-pound weaklings, trying to pump themselves up with powdered tiger's milk. Their political and cultural naivete is astounding. France suffers from an overstructured educational system that produces a vigorous but one-dimensional form of reasoning descending from the 17th century. Despite the French reputation for love, cultivated French personality is highly repressed. French high culture, like that of the Japanese, is insular and superbly artificial. Since Racine, the French language is French culture. It is cold, elegant, ironic, linear, constricting. Gautier, Baudelaire, and Huysmans were complaining about the excessive sanitation of educated French well over a century ago. The balanced phrase forms and repetitious internal rhythms of French thought can be heard in virtually any French movie of the past 50 years, particularly when the characters begin to discourse on love. Their affectations, pomposity, and self-deceptions are a major source of comedy, exploited by Renoir, Buñuel, Truffaut, Godard, Chabrol. The French, locked in by over-intellection, require radical deconstruction of their speech, persona, and worldview. Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault have no relevance to anything outside of post-war France. They are performing necessary acts of verbal and conceptual violence upon a culture as walled and arrogantly self-centered as the Chinese imperial palace. Most American academics are totally lost when trying to read French polemic. They have no idea that in French you can form sentences that are virtually content-free, that are merely rhetorical flourishes echoing, reversing, or sabotaging prior French sentences. Translations of Lacan and Derrida are pored over by earnest Americans, fatuously taking as literal truth statements that were merely the malicious boutades of the flaneur. Lacan and Derrida are meaningless unless you already have in your head the austere, sonorous, classical French sentences that they are twisting and wringing like a washcloth. Our French acolytes, making themselves the lackeys of a foreign fascism, have advertised their intellectual emptiness to the world. In America, deconstruction is absurd, since we have never had a high culture of any kind. Far from being over-literate, we are still pre-literate, accentuated by an image-dominated popular culture that was the all-embracing paideia of my generation. American personality, far from being trapped in decorum, is booming, pushy, manic, facilely optimistic. At its essence, it is infantile in its beaming, bouncing egotism, a character type seen in film in the bumptious newlywed husband of Niagara, the suburban Connecticut host mixing honey daiquiris in Auntie Mama, the griping Yahoo spurning Venetian food in summertime, or that French favorite Jerry Lewis, whose giddy, tumbling spontaneity represents everything that is impossible in mannerly France. America is still a frontier country of wide-open spaces. Our closeness to nature is one reason why our problem is not repression, but regression. Our notorious violence is the constant eruption of primitivism, of anarchic individualism. The 60s attempted a return to nature that ended in disaster. The gentle nude bathing and playful sliding in the mud at Woodstock were a short-lived Rousseau-esque dream. My generation, inspired by the Dionysian titanism of rock, attempted something more radical than anything since the French Revolution. We asked, why should I obey this law? And why shouldn't I act on every sexual impulse? The result was a descent into barbarism. We painfully discovered that a just society cannot, in fact, function if everyone does his own thing. And out of the pagan promiscuity of the 60s came AIDS. Everyone of my generation who preached free love is responsible for AIDS. The 60s revolution in America collapsed because of its own excesses. It followed and fulfilled its own inner historical pattern, a fall from romanticism into decadence. In France, in contrast, the brief student and worker revolt was put down by government action, an external force. Armchair French leftists, like Foucault, went into a permanent sulk. They never saw the errors of their ideas because those ideas, through lack of French moxie, were never tested against reality by being put through their full organic cycle. Hence the utter madness of French leftist pretensions being flaunted by milquetoast academics in America, which as a nation had made an epic journey to the heart of darkness and returned with tragic truths. The American 60s already contained every revolutionary insight. We didn't need Derrida, we had Jimi Hendrix. In the blazing, psychedelic guitar work of this black genius, time, space, form, voice, person were deconstructed. Floating oriental suspensions released the categorizations of European mind. Hendrix's radical artistic statement, with its raw elemental sound effects of earth, air, water, and fire, addressed both nature and culture and therefore dwarfed society, obsessed French thought. Psychedelia's deconstructions, unlike Derrida's, destroyed the safe and known for one purpose: expanded vision. The 60s saw the cosmos and were awed by it. The French, frolicking in their miniature stone garden, haven't had a cosmic thought since Pascal. America, furthermore, by virtue of its overlapping and competing ethnicities, Jewish, Italian, Greek, Puerto Rican, Chicano, Irish, Swedish, German, Polish, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, had intrinsic to its character as an immigrant nation a multiplicity of perspective on life, language, and behavior that snobbish, homogeneous France, suppressing its resident Algerians, lacks. Derrida, an Algerian Jew, had his own private agenda in France that is not applicable to America. The 60s were also a great age of cinema. My generation, transferring to college campuses the cult atmosphere of urban art film houses, sat in rapt, reverent silence, now totally lost, before hundreds of Hollywood classics and subtitled foreign films in a dozen languages. Through film, we gained an international and transhistorical understanding, a mobility of mind that freed us from the parochial domestic 50s. France was present, but as only one item in our cultural overview. Resnais and Robbe-Grillet's operatic, Last Year at Marienbad, dramatized the burden of history and, like Kurosawa's Rashomon, the relativity of time, memory, and narrative. Ingmar Bergman's bleak Northern trilogy dealt with the death of God and meaning, and, in the silence, the death of language, significantly transcended by music. Persona, a masterpiece, showed the tyranny of medical authority, the breakdown of the social mask, the cruelty and amorality of the unconscious, the intermingling of fantasy and reality. Antonioni's L'Avventura followed, at trance-like length, the questing individual lost in the rocky landscape of modern desolation. Blow Up, through its dissolving crime photographs, addressed the subjectivity of perception, and, in its closing mimed tennis game, the fictiveness of community and social behavior. Fellini's films showed consciousness riddled and vexed by sexual fantasy and guilt, a daily war with spectral, internalized censors. Lawrence of Arabia was a real-life parable of imperialism, racism, and power politics, of idealism collapsing into cynicism. Finally, the Marx Brothers, their popularity restored, performed elaborate, surreal deconstructions of language, manners, public decorum, verbal, social, and sexual formulas of every kind. What I am demonstrating is that anyone culturally awake in the American 60s was already deeply immersed in all the issues that entered the Academy, in grotesquely distorted programmatic form, through the French keyhole in the 70s. Far from being au courant sophisticates, the French acolytes were toadying careerists untouched by the 60s. I will never forget the first time I heard the name Lacan pronounced by a fellow woman graduate student at a Yale cocktail party with a haughty, clarion-like, head-tossing, triumphant smugness of discovery that would have embarrassed Marie Curie. I saw the first clustering of yuppies around Paul de Man, who, because I was reading Freud, Fraser, Nietzsche, and Sade, thinkers of distinction, seemed to me bland and phony, an ideal model for Ivy League wasps trying to resist the ethnic, sexual, and pop culture revolution of the 60s. Hence de Man's delightful recent exposure as a Nazi sympathizer did not surprise me in the least. The 70s theory explosion was a panic reaction by headlocked pedants unable to cope with the emotional and sensory flux of the iconoclastic psychedelic 60s. It was a desperate search for new authority, new dogma. It misused and abused modernist concepts for personal cachet and professional advancement. alienation, anxiety, and relativity, as embodied in film, still retained major principles stripped away by the theorists, with their fanatical, sterile mind games. The beauty of the human face, the power of emotion, the allure of the visual, the presence of nature, in sea, moon, cloud, night, the virtuosity of the artist as actor, cinematographer, or auteur-director, and above all, the magnetism and complexity of sex. The French theorists are heiress killers. The smoldering eroticism of great European actresses like Jeanne Moreau demonstrated to my generation woman's archetypal mystery and glamour, completely missing from the totalitarian worldview of the misogynist Foucault. For me, the big French D is not Derrida, but Deneuve. The psychedelic 60s were about opening oneself to sensations and messages from above, below, and beyond the social realm. We sought the oracular, the mystic, vibrations between persons and planets. A poem or film had a magic authority. The French 70s, on the other hand, were about rigid mental control, power plays by the critic over the artist and text. Academics with the souls of accountants now approached art like a business deal, haggling over negotiable, movable clauses. The older beat poets, by their disdain for material possessions, were a spiritual example to us in the 60s. In Howl and Kaddish, Allen Ginsberg fused the American bardic tradition of Whitman with Jewish moral passion to deconstruct institutions, history, social class, and concepts of sexual and mental normality. Through his impact on Bob Dylan, Ginsberg changed rock and the world. What did the academic 70s offer? Not a fiery holy man, but plastic Ken dolls, beady-eyed, greedy, cutthroat. Ginsberg, like the pioneering Lenny Bruce, who turned comedy towards social critique, was influenced by the rich, melodious voices and syncopated jazz rhythms of black music. African American culture is still rooted in the rural South, with its evangelical fervor and fire-breathing preachers. The blues shouters and black gospel choirs are alive and ecstatic with, quote, the spirit, which the French theorists wouldn't recognize unless it came up and hit them in the head. Walk in Philadelphia on a Sunday morning, and you will hear majestic Niagaras of sound pouring from the black churches, and who's doing the preaching in Ivy League humanities departments? Lily-livered, dead-ass, trash-talking foreign junk bond dealers. The School of Saussure knows in the dictionary, can't see the ancient art form of dance, the sacred poetry of the body, which has made America the envy of the world. Black teenagers, with brilliant virtuosity, push forward the frontiers of dance. Month by month on the street, they invent new movements that are recorded on music videos and beamed around the world, to the helpless amazement of European and Japanese admirers who cannot imitate them. I have a dream. In my dream, based on the diner episode in The Blues Brothers, Aretha Franklin, in her fabulous black lipstick Jumpin' Jack Flash outfit, leaps from her seat at Maxim's and, shouting, think, blasts Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault like dish rags against the wall, then leads thousands of freed academic white slaves in a victory parade down the Champs-Élysées. The French invasion of the 70s had nothing to do with leftism or genuine politics, but everything to do with good old-fashioned American capitalism, which liberal academics pretend to scorn. The collapse of the job market due to recession and university retrenchment after the baby boom era caused economic hysteria. As faculties were cut, commercial self-packaging became a priority. Academics, never renowned for courage, fled beneath the safe umbrella of male authority and one-man rule. The French bigwigs offered to their disciples a soothing, esoteric code and a sense of belonging to an elite, an intellectually superior unit, at a time when the market told academics they were useless and dispensable. It is comical that these vain, foolish, irrelevant people, so contemptuous of American society, imagine themselves to be leftists. They understand nothing of America. And because of their ignorance, Mercury, god of commerce, forced them into a historical pattern they are blind to. Far from being the lone, brave dissenters against conservatism, as David Halperin ineptly claims, the academic theorists were the first wave of yuppie speculators, the first corporate raiders of the Wall Street Gilded Age. The facile industry of high-tech criticism is as busily all-American as the Detroit auto trade. New, improved. See next year's model today. A false progressivism has goaded the profession into a frantic tarantella. Hurry up, get on the ball. You must keep up with, must stay in front. But the humanities, unlike medicine, marine biology, and astrophysics, are about great enduring human truths that in fact never change, but are rediscovered again and again. The humanities are about insight, illumination, wisdom. French theory, with its empty wordplay, produces sophists, experts in getting ahead, getting worldly rewards. It allows a continuation not of 60s leftism, but of 50s prep schools, with their snide, slick style, a cool, insufferably pretentious, nasal voice you can hear everywhere on Ivy League campuses. French theory is brand name consumerism. Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault are the academic equivalents of BMW, Rolex, and Cuisinart, the yuppie trophies. French theory is computerized thinking, super clean and risk-free. It's the Macintosh that drags the icons to the trash, and it's the Big Mac of fast food, on-the-run dining. The McDonaldization of the profession means standardized, interchangeable outlets, briskly efficient academics who think alike and sound alike. Scholars have made themselves into lockstep computer technicians, up on and hawking the latest gadget of the month. French theory is like those how-to tapes guaranteed to make you a real estate millionaire overnight. Gain power by attacking power, make a killing, be a master of the universe. Call this number in Paris now. The self-made inferno of the academic junk bond era is the conferences, where the din of ambition is as deafening as on the floor of the stock exchange. The huge post-60s proliferation of conferences, used as an administrative marketing tool by colleges and universities, produced a diversion of professional energy away from study and toward performance, networking, advertisement, cruising, hustling, glad-handing, back-scratching, chit-chat, groupthink. Interdisciplinary innovation? Hardly. Real interdisciplinary work is done reading and writing at home and in the library. The conferences teach corporate rating. Academics become lone wolves without loyalty to their own disciplines or institutions. They're always on the trail and on the lookout, ears up for the better job and bigger salary, the next golden fleece or golden parachute. The conferences are all about insider trading and racketeering, jockeying for power by fast-track traveling salesmen, pushing their shrink-wrapped product and tooting fancy new commercial slogans. The conferences induce a delusional removal from reality. They mislead fad followers like Halperin and Winkler into beginning ridiculous statements with, we think, we say, we do this or that. No, we don't. That's you, the teeming conference hoppers, the plague of locusts and froglets croaking in their tiny pond. In the conferences, a host of Bartleby the Scriveners tippy-toe through showy verbal pirouettes and imagine they're running with the bulls at Pamplona. But the menu, as the chorus chants in Monty Python, is nothing but spam, spam, spam. The conferences are lightweight shuttlecock scholarship, where the divorced can trawl for new spouses and where people meet in an airless bubble to confirm each other's false assumptions and certitudes. A new Dunciad is needed to chart the reefs and shoals of this polluted, boat-choked racecourse where no one ever gets anywhere. Whole careers have gone down the tubes at the conferences. Dozens of prominent academics are approaching the moment of reckoning, when they and everyone else will realize they have wasted the best years of their professional lives on cutesy mini-papers and globe-trotting. By their books ye shall know them. A scholar's real audience is not yet born. A scholar must build for the future, not the present. The profession is addicted to the present, to contemporary figures, contemporary terminology, contemporary concerns. Authentic theory would mean mastery of the complete history of philosophy and aesthetics. What is absurdly called theory today is just a mask for fashion and greed. The conferences are the alphabet city of addiction to junk, the self-numbing anodyntia of rootless, soulless people who have lost contact with their own ethnic traditions. Their work will die with them, for it is based on neither learning nor inspired interpretation. The conferences are oppressive bourgeois forms that enforce a style of affected patter and smarmy whimsy in the speaker, and polite chuckles and iron-butt torpor in the audience. Success at the conferences requires a certain kind of physically inert personality, superficially cordial but emotionally dissociated. It's the genteel, high Protestant style of the country clubs and corporate boardrooms, with their financial reports and marketing presentations. The transient intimacies of the conferences are themselves junk bonds. Dante would classify the conference hoppers as perverters of intellect, bad guides, sowers of schism. The conferences have left a paper trail of folly and trivial pursuit. True scholars are time travelers, not space travelers. Rattling away on their gerbil wheels, the conference-caged theorists replicate the rabid turf wars of Paris, where an intellectual's every sentence is a calculated self-positioning against another intellectual, an incestuous Peyton Place solipsism impenetrable to gullible Americans. One of recent theory's most provincial conference groupies, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, whose writing on sex is, in my opinion, completely factitious and without scholarly merit. But by the dogged determination that Richard Nixon showed on the rubber chicken circuit, Sedgwick has managed to convert pedestrian critical skills and little discernible knowledge in history, philosophy, psychology, art, or even pre-modern literature into a lucrative academic career. Sedgwick is a notorious bloated blurbist, turning out inflated dust jacket encomia for Halperin, and in perhaps the dopiest blurb of the decade, it mentioned ozone, D.A. Miller. She should be giving lectures in marketing and consumer science to business schools. The junk bond era has also spawned something that calls itself New Historicism. This seems to be a refuge for English majors without critical talent or broad learning in history or political science. Its style is Joan Didion crossed with the National Geographic, glossy, formulaic, unrigorous. New Historicism is of the yuppies, by the yuppies, for the yuppies. To practice it, you apparently must lack all historical sense. My idea of political analysis began with Thucydides and Tacitus. My interest in bridging the gap between disciplines was nourished by reading Vico, Tocqueville, Veblen, Durkheim, Weber, Spengler, Curtius, Panofsky, and Eliade, as well as Nietzsche, Hauser, and Brown. What do new historicists read? Their contemporary, Clifford Geertz, who can't hold a candle to the magisterial, monumental Arnold Hauser. The anecdotal, microchip manner of new historicism is yuppie grazing, cuisine monsieur in a quiche and fern bistro. At its best, In Stephen Greenblatt, it is still too bright, crisp, clean, too dressed for success. As a student at Yale, Greenblatt had available as models two brilliant exemplars of his own spiritual tradition, the ascetic, poetic Jeffrey Hartman and the turbulent, brooding Harold Bloom. But Greenblatt's books, waving vaguely from a distance at 60s ideas, go the old bland wasp route, where nothing is actually personally risked or exposed. There is no passion or suffering, no deep learning. Everything is carefully measured against its immediate reception. The new historicists, carrying contemporary baggage into other eras, are simply repeating the cultural imperialism of British colonels laying out high tea in the jungle. New historicism is the no-sweat, pain-free, careerist gentrification of authentic 60s leftism. Foucault is the ideal thinker for the Yuppie age. He is the master of the quick fix, of make it to the top by any means. Twist the facts, doctor the balance sheet, toss out veteran employees, bring in the smart-mouthed brats, turn the world into one big power lunch. Foucault perfects the wasp alienation of mind and culture from emotion. There are no untidy ambiguities in his system. Everything is rigidly schematic, overdetermined, reducible to chart form. Contradictory evidence is never admitted. Foucault represents the final decadence of Western Apollonianism, a cold, desiccated fetishism of pure IQ, divorced from humor, compassion, ethics, eroticism, wisdom. It is this same combination of maniacal abstraction with lust for personal power that led to the deranged orderliness of the concentration camps. There is a constant rush to judgment in Foucault. He is filled with speediest generalizations, false categorizations, distortions, fudging, pretenses to knowledge in areas where he was ignorant. He had no ability whatever to discriminate among historical sources, where he makes terrible blunders. Foucault had the kind of clever but limited mind that is good at inventing acrostics, crossword puzzles, and computer programs. He had little major talent beyond this, except for a genius for self-promotion. The word modest recurs in descriptions of Foucault as a person and writer, to which I reply, there's a sucker born every minute. As a writer, Foucault was an arrogant bastard. He did not believe in truth and so never sought it. His books, clumsily researched but overconfidently argued, show language-obsessed Parisian parochialism become paranoia, delusional, and obsessive-compulsive. Foucault is the Cagliostro of our time. Nowhere is this more evident than in his treatment of Émile Durkheim, his true source. Those who, like Halperin, claim Foucault's descent from Nietzsche are simply Foucault's dupe. An entire book could be written applying Harold Bloom's theory of anxiety of influence to Foucault's desperate concealment of his massive indebtedness to Durkheim, to whom he barely, dismissively, and inaccurately refers. Innumerable discussions of Foucault, including G. Mercur's excellent Foucault, 1985, which hilariously exposes the elementary errors made by Foucault in every area he wrote about, do not even mention Durkheim. This illustrates the kind of interdisciplinary incomprehension that has allowed Foucault to appear erudite when he was not. The undeserved adulation of Foucault's Discipline and Punish reminds me of that priceless moment at the 1980 Oscars when John Voight, sitting in the front row as he listened to Laurence Olivier give fey, meandering, and parodistic thanks, was addled and overcome, mouthed a silent, mackerel-like wow, and smacked himself in the middle of his forehead. American humanists, untutored EM sociology, are knocked out by Foucault's daring. Analyze crime and punishment, prisons and penal codes. Gee, I wish I'd thought of that. Well, Foucault didn't think of it either. It's in Durkheim's The The Division of Labor in Society, 1893. Foucault extends Durkheim's argument one step further but covers up the influence. Look at Durkheim's Primitive Classification, 1903, and you will see the shadow of Foucault's phrases about taxonomy. Durkheim is everywhere in Foucault. The intricate complexities of analysis of organizations and power groups in Max Weber make Foucault look like a tyro. It is only ignorance of the social sciences that has allowed Foucault to rise to cult status among pitifully unprepared American humanists. I am not aware of any woman in the world doing work on a higher intellectual level than the British sociologist Gillian Rose. In Dialectic of Nihilism, Post-Structuralism and Law, 1984, she administers a well-earned drubbing to both Foucault and Derrida that demonstrates their circular reasoning and misreading of basic sources. Foucault's is falsely used by naive American academics as a scholarly source of information, as if he were Fernand Braudel. But you cannot trust a single fact in Foucault. His books should be called Foucault's Diaries. They have no relationship to historical reality. They are simply devious improvisations in the style of G.D.'s The Counterfeiters. They attract game-playing minds with unresolved malice towards society, people who give lip service to rebellion but who lack the guts to actually rebel and pay the price. Derrida is smack for the spirit, but Foucault is the academic cocaine, the yuppie drug of choice of the 70s and 80s. In the 60s, LSD gave vision, while marijuana gave community. But coke, pricey and jealously hoarded, is the power drug, giving a rush of omnipotent self-assurance. Work done under its influence is manic, febrile, choppy, disconnected. Coke was responsible for the plot incoherence of 15 years of TV sitcoms and glitzy, high-concept Hollywood films. Foucault is the high-concept pusher and deal-maker of the cocaine decades. His big squishy pink marshmallow word is power, which neither he nor his followers fully understand. It caroms around picking up lint and dog hair, but is no substitute for political analysis. Foucault's ignorance of prehistory and ancient history, based in the development and articulation of cultures and legal codes, makes his discussions of power ociose. He never asks how power is gained or lost, justly administered or abused. He does not show how efficient procedures get over-formalized, entrenched, calcified, then shattered and reformed. He has no familiarity with theories of social or biological hierarchies, such as the, quote, pecking order universally observed in farmyards and schoolyards. Because, in the faddish French way, he ridiculously denies personality exists, he cannot assess the impact of strong personalities on events, nor can he, like Weber, catalog types of authority or prestige. He is inept in comparing different governmental structures. Because he cannot deal with flux or dynamic change, he is hopeless with protracted power struggles. An astute political analyst would have begun his reflections with the long conflict between pharaoh and priesthood in Egypt, or between emperor and army in late Rome, patterns still observable in our century's ongoing power struggles between college administrations and faculties, or between Hollywood corporations, banks, and studios on the one hand, and directors, actors, and screenwriters on the other. Foucault, like Lacan and Derrida, is 40 years out of date. He does not see and cannot deal with the radical transformation of culture by new technology and mass media following World War II. He overlooks the economic role of entrepreneurship, and he is blind to the dominance of personality in our pagan age of Hollywood. Liberal academics are stuck in a time warp, invoking the Foucault buzzwords surveillance and the police. They try to recreate the 50s world of J. Edgar Hoover and Dragnet. the last lost moment of liberalism's political authenticity before it was destroyed by my generation's excesses. It is mildly nauseating to see this snide use of the police as a literary cliché coming from spoiled, wifty, middle-class academics who would be the first to shriek for the police if a burglar or rapist came through the window. And as for surveillance, Foucault-style language analysis seems lame and monotonous compared to the treatment of the same theme by Sade, Blake, Poe, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Kafka, Brecht, or even Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone. The cultural mode of the post-60s era is not surveillance, but voyeurism, ours. Eye energy, thanks to omnipresent television, is going in the opposite direction. Institutions are the modern reality principle. Current academic liberalism cannot understand the fragility of institutions or the ease with which order, due process, and civil liberties can be destroyed by assertions of anarchic selfhood. As a battle-scarred 60s veteran, I learned this the hard way. Humanists like to childishly sneer and snort about the system, but they are quick to hide behind it, to pose from its forum at conferences, and to use it as a lifelong gravy train. The academic popularity of Foucault, Lacan, and Derrida was produced by the poor educational preparation of American humanists, who appear to have slept through college. In the basic biology class of my first college semester in 1964, we studied the pre-Socratics, with their competing and contradictory theories of the origins and constituency of matter. Heraclitus, in particular, to whom I had already been introduced by Walter Pater, contains everything that is in Derrida and more. We later studied the Western development of scientific classification schemes and the checkered history of evolutionary and genetic theories, from Lamarck through Mendel and Darwin. In basic geology, the next year, we learned how to think in huge time frames and how to analyze multiple layering and inversions in mixed physical evidence. At no time in my education or reading was science ever presented as an absolutist, dogmatic methodology, the way it is constantly maligned these days by French befuddled humanists. We saw, following Aristotle and his 17th century admirers, that science is a system of provisional hypotheses, open to constant revision and disproof. In classical art and history, we were impressed with modern archaeology's tender solicitude for the tiniest chips and fragments of vanished cultures, with the excruciatingly slow and heroically self-abnegating excavation, measurement, numbering, photography, extraction, cleaning, cataloging, restoration, and preservation of artifacts. It was exasperation and impatience with dull potsherds that ended my childhood dream of becoming an archaeologist. In introductory social science, we learned that the 19th century rise of anthropology as a discipline hastened a new cultural relativism that shifted Europe from centrality. We were shown how anthropology is a limited interpretation by aliens who inevitably alter the small societies they enter and observe. As for Saussure, from the moment we began Latin class in junior high school, we were told, in simple, common-sense terms, that language is an arbitrary, self-enclosed system that varies from culture to culture, a point obvious to everyone studying languages for the last 200 years. Even the hot dog vendor on the street would never mistake the word elephant for a real elephant. The French school, tickling its own buttocks, is in a state of dementia about the actual facts of modem thought. It has nothing whatever new or important to say. The English professors who ran off after the French, like the stampede of silly knights, whom Spencer's bemused Britomart watches disappearing after the, to me, false Florimel, were demonstrating an inadequate grasp of their own literary tradition. Blake's conceptual, mind-forged manacles, his exploited chimney sweeps coerced and brainwashed by adult maxims, the barely verbal ego and primitive sensory state of infant joy, the oppressive institutional walls of London, the Orc-Urizen cycle of rebellion and repression, the spiritual combat of delusional mental emanations and projections in the long poems. Here, at the birth of Romanticism, is every major theme that ends up as stale French pretzels at the last gasp of modernism. Lytton Strachey, notably in his treatment of Florence Nightingale as a secret imperialist, has Foucault's debunking method already. Sensational 50s prison and sanitarium movies, like The Snake Pit and Suddenly Last Summer, make Foucault's points more entertainingly. In 1952, in his study of schizophrenics in Psychoanalytic Explorations in Art, Ernst Chris demonstrated that artistic creativity is a distortion of received categories, supporting the connection between art and madness that had been a truism for centuries. Bob Dylan's Subterranean Homesick Blues, Desolation Row, and Ballad of a Thin Man, the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, Jumpin' Jack Flash, and Street Fighting Man, Jim Morrison's line for The Doors, Send my credentials to the House of Detention. These angry romantic statements, haunted by nature and culture, are the true voice of our time. My idol is Keith Richards, the Rolling Stones rhythm guitarist, who made menacing music out of the Dionysian darkness never seen by society-obsessed Foucault. The thunderous power chords of hard rock smash the dreary little world of French theory. The French have no sense of elemental realities. They could never have produced a D.H. Lawrence, a Neruda, an Allen Ginsberg. If the history of ideas, including science, were properly taught, the French influence would shrivel to nothing. Foucault, crippled by his ignorance of antiquity, never saw until it was too late that Enlightenment scientism was a revival of Greek Apollonian taxonomies. Rather than admit he had been dreadfully wrong, he devised campaign after campaign of further deception and self-concealment. His style is to pretend to find symmetrical little categories, actually as random as the rolling plums on a slot machine. American humanists, who can't think their way out of a paper bag, gape in wonder at these lofty displays of false logic. Foucault's orderliness is that of a scowling, squinting, round-shouldered person, ramming knitting needles into a great pile of badly mixed, sticky bread dough. The humanists are blinded by the flashing skewers. What matchless penetration breathes the dazzled Halperin. But informed scholars recognize a blob when they see one. And skewer ramming is no way to bake bread. Foucault's taxonomies are always arbitrarily imposed and never generated by the evidence. He treats his material and readers in exactly the fascist way he claims society treats the body, as a manichean, without its own animal energy or internal processes. As a flunky of Saussure, Foucault has to keep nature invisible at all times. This makes it impossible for him to honestly explore the necessary role of repression in such features of education and child rearing as toilet training, simple basic issues never far from our minds in America, with its strong tradition of practical and social psychology. There are two main areas where Foucault is severely deficient. First is his picture of consciousness, which is trapped in the contours of French language and culture in ways he never remotely saw. But beyond this, Foucault does not understand global or associative clusters of meaning. Most disastrously for someone claiming to discover the epistemès intrinsic to a period, he has no feeling for metaphorical or symbolic thinking. Without metaphor, literature and art are incomprehensible. Without symbolism, love, religion, and patriotism are incomprehensible. Reading or teaching Joyce's Ulysses requires more nimbleness with multiple linguistic and cultural codes than was ever displayed by Foucault. The most serious flaw of Foucault's system is in the area of sex. I view his hurried, compulsive writing as a massive rationalist defense formation to avoid thinking about A. Woman, B. Nature, C. Emotion, and D. The sexual body. His attempt to make the body the passive property of male society is an evasion of the universal facts so intolerable to him that we are all born of human mothers. By turning women into ciphers of men, he miniaturizes and contains them. Most of Foucault is just recycled, denatured Rousseauism. His police state is a third-rate film noir, but significantly missing the beautiful, mysterious woman. Foucault sees power everywhere except where it is greatest, the female principle. It is no surprise he attracts mostly men who are always ready to believe that the verbal and rational explain everything. Foucault's antiseptic world has neat hospital corners. He has scrubbed away woman's messy emotional centrality. The fruits of Foucault are wormwood. He was a Herod without a Salome. This was a man of mutilated psyche. If what I have reliably heard about his public behavior after he knew he had AIDS is true, then Foucault would deserve the condemnation of every ethical person. 6 months ago, perusing the new releases at the library, I came upon Robert Drew's The Coming of the Greeks. In the next 2 days, I read this slim book with electrified attention and with tears in my eyes. Here is the great Western analytic tradition that my generation of trendy yuppies has thrown out the window. There are 2,500 years of continuous philosophical, scholarly, and monastic practice behind this logical, luminous, transparent style. Drew's, speculating about an early period of European population migration, for which the evidence is scanty, presents and argues his controversial case with absolute honesty. There is no propaganda, no distortion, no sleight of hand, no intention to deceive, none of the academic immorality that swept the profession in the 70s and 80s. Every syllable of this book is precise and painstakingly qualified. This is the real sophistication, the real theoretical expertise. Drew's has the scholarly power so advanced that it makes him invisible. Fine fabrics, which last forever, can be recognized by an experienced eye from across the room. Drew's writing has the weave, the texturing, the stitching of high intellectual quality. Academe has been flooded by French knockoffs, shoddy pret-a-porter merchandise. Robert Drew's has the Anglo-American goods for all seasons. What is needed now is a return to genuine historicism, based on knowledge of and respect for the past. The fashionable French posturing, "There are no facts," has got to stop. There are no certainties, but there are well-supported facts, which we can learn and build on, always with the flexible, scholarly skepticism that allows us to discard prior assumptions in the face of new evidence. If there were no facts, surgeons couldn't operate, buildings would collapse, and airplanes wouldn't get off the ground. Critics got themselves into a muddle by trying to study literature alone, without mastery of the other arts. The word-created subjectivities of literature, particularly in modern, non-mimetic fiction, have lured feeble minds into believing nothing exists in the universe outside academe. Familiarity with the visual arts, which must prepare physical materials like paints and metals in scientific ways, would have prevented many of the idiocies that have poured from literature departments in the past 20 years. The skepticism claimed by deconstruction is a bookworm affectation by tunnel vision careerists. That art is its own self-contained transhistorical system, I also believe, following my study of Gautier, Baudelaire, Pater, and Wilde. But that every work of art is by definition stylistically or conceptually self-referential is simply ridiculous. This principle does apply to certain kinds of ironic, late-phase works, like Tristram Shandy, Finnegan's Wake, or Duchamp's doctored Mona Lisa. But it makes no sense at all with classicism, most of high romanticism, or the major 19th century social realist novels. It was in reading Tristram Shandy for class in graduate school that I noticed how it is primarily men who gravitate toward the game-playing self-reflexive style. There is an alienation from emotion in it, a nervous Nelly fear of letting go and being exposed. As an attitude toward life, it betrays a perpetual adolescence. Those who hurled themselves after Derrida were not the most sophisticated, but the most pedestrian, most pretentious, and least creative members of my generation of academics. Bergman's persona is a masterpiece, not because the film jumps its sprockets at the end, quote, I am a movie, but because it confronts and explores the emotional, psychological, and moral tensions of Western personality. The epic saga of life and art cannot even be seen, much less understood, by the toy techno trinkets of the French school. We have available to us two great Western traditions of skepticism and disputation, the Hellenic and the Judaic. Our educational and legal systems have been heavily influenced by Greco-Roman philosophy, rhetoric, and oratory, partly transmitted through the Catholic Church, whose theology was born in the Hellenized Eastern Mediterranean. Jewish thinkers, because of their ancient heritage in religious law, have been pioneers in legal philosophy since the Middle Ages. Modern America has a strong Jewish presence in the literary, legal, medical, and scientific worlds. There is nothing more thrilling than listening to two New York rabbis aggressively debate each other on a radio talk show. The intellectual vigor of Talmudic disputation puts the theory wing of American academe to shame. It is no coincidence that my mentors have always been Jews. We have right here on native soil a superb high-energy model of subtle inquiry, humanistic compassion, and profound learning. It was from Jews, beginning at T. Aaron Levy Junior High School, that I learned how to analyze politics, law, business, and medicine, how to decipher the power dynamics of family relationships, and how to plan pragmatic strategies of social activism. The Jews know there is a story in history, for they have suffered it. Those who deny there is meaning or order in events have their heads in the sand. One of the most unpalatable aspects of the French fad is the way it has shown ambitious academics drifting from and selling out their own cultural identity. Foucault is white bread and mayo for the assimilated Jews. America had another vivid analytic style of informed commentary and dissent, that of male homosexuals in the pre-Stonewall period, gay liberation allowing greater freedom of assembly, sexual expression, and personal style, also unfortunately diverted toward recreation energies which had earlier been absorbed in aggressive, witty discourse. In college, I was stunned and exhilarated by the bold free-thinking and cruel irreverence of gay men who respected no conservative or liberal piety, even of the humanitarian polio crisis. My admiring memory of their revolutionary, philosophy-like iconoclasm makes me most regretful about recent infringements of free speech by a few overzealous AIDS activists who have made themselves the arbiters of a new dogma and enforced it with terroristic tactics. Injustice cannot be remedied by injustice. The examples of Gandhi and Martin Luther King show that civil rights movements best succeed when they are guided by ethical principles. Gay men, even more than Jews, have the most to lose from unilateral suspensions of civil liberties. As the gay community became a crowded, glittery, fast-paced world unto itself, gay men began to lose the brilliant mental edge that they had had in the old haunted world of masks, where comedy was born of suffering. Ironically, as public acceptance has increased, Gay commentary on the straight world has gotten more strident and less insightful, partly through a bad influence from sloppy feminist rhetoric. The Halperin and Winkler books show the sad decline in quality of thought from corrosive independence into self-righteous groupthink. Once gay men were the enemies of jargon, cliché, and cant. Once gay men, through their avant-garde study of the minute history of art, antiques, interior design, fashion, music, opera, Broadway shows, and Hollywood movies, were masters of an archaeology of culture, hypersensitively acute to chronology, style, tradition. Only the drag queens, my heroes, have preserved the old gay aesthetic, which elevates eternal beauty and imagination over politics. It is not too late to restore it to centrality, and it is not too soon to start talking about ethics. Gay studies, if it expects academic legitimacy, must follow the scholarly lead of the rigorous James Saslow, not the slipshod David Halperin. Part 4. My proposals for academic reform are meant to put learning back at the center of the profession. Mastery of historical facts and dates, with interpretation a necessary but secondary process, should be strictly required of both faculty and students. The present highly subjective, essay-centered humanities curriculum preserves bourgeois Protestant models of discourse that discriminate against those of other cultural backgrounds or temperaments, and that encourage a calculating, careerist style of student response. Literary essay writing, perfected by the prep schools, has turned into a con game. In my experience with freshmen from minority urban or southern rural families, the fairest educational method reduces the course to orderly bodies of material that can be approached and mastered by anyone, given sufficient application. This is true equality of opportunity. Success in a humanities course, as much as one in medicine or law, should be contingent upon present effort, not upon skill in facile word games learned elsewhere. At the same time, I would like to liberalize classroom teaching, to free it from the iron yoke of the prefab daily syllabus, and allow more room for improvisation, especially in lectures. The teacher is present as a living, breathing embodiment of the humanities. Interpretation begins with the teacher's ability to think out loud and to follow the beguiling stream of associations, often inspired by the students themselves, in their many moods from euphoria to narcolepsy. This liberalization is not inconsistent with an overall tightening of standards. There should be an imposing roster of primary and secondary texts for independent study, assessed by long and grueling exams. The classroom should be heaven, the exam room hell. Teacher training, recruitment, and review require extensive reform. Specialists are the last thing undergraduates need. We have a generation of latchkey children, the product of divorce and absentee working parents. Many were raised by permissive 60s parents loath to impose repressive religion on their children. Consequently, our students are anxious, adrift, often self-destructive. They are desperately searching for meaning. We need reconstruction, not deconstruction. All undergraduate teachers should be generalists. The curriculum should be radically restructured. There would be 3 large areas: science, social science, and humanities. All present humanities departments would be dissolved into each other. The graduate schools would begin preparing for this shift by forbidding specialization in any one art form, much less one period within an art form. Graduate students need cultural broadening and expansion, not narrowing and concentration. They would be required to become conversant with a minimum of 2 art forms in all world cultures and periods. If necessary, they would be forced to take undergraduate courses to remedy their deficiencies. There is no need for specialized graduate course work in literature or art history. The materials for such study are fully available in the library. Exams alone could test mastery for degree certification. The undergraduate curriculum would be severely stripped down. Pork barrel specialist courses, a form of gross exploitation by which professors have made students do their research for them, would be abolished. All courses, except those dealing with major thinkers and artists of the rank of Plato, Dante, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, and Picasso, would have to be interdisciplinary and cover a minimum 50-year span. The freshman and sophomore years would consist of basic courses required of all students. All professors, no matter how famous, would be compelled to teach in the basic program. A rigorous history of ideas framework would be devised on the Columbia model, taught by both humanities and social science faculty, who would have to interact in preparatory meetings and thus begin to find the common ground between disciplines. All upper-level courses would be rotated. Courses would be assigned on the basis of what a professor does not know, rather than on what he does. This would put learning at the heart of the enterprise and keep the institution in a constant dynamic ferment of discovery and exploration. Academe needs deprofessionalization and de-yuppification. It has to recover its clerical or spiritual roots. Scholarship is an ideal and a calling, not merely a trade or living. Every year at commencement, we put on medieval robes that connect us to a great monastic past. We should be in the world, but not of it. Our vocation is a ministry. There is no truth, but as thinkers we are obliged to seek it. The present system is geared to producing careerist academics rather than scholars or intellectuals. Specialization belongs only to personal professional research. It has no place whatever in undergraduate education. I call for a total abolition of the annual Modern Language Association convention sessions, 609.99 over 4 days in December 1990, for 3 reasons. They splinter the profession into political special interest groups like Washington Piazzi lobbyists. They encourage the midget format of the talk, which is simply a vehicle for cozy relationships and networking. They occur too close to the formal marketing apparatus of the profession and are therefore corrupted by it. The MLA convention crams the money changers into the temple instead of driving them out. Job recruitment should seek these qualities in a candidate. A. Overall mastery of the Western artistic and intellectual tradition. B. Ability to relate our tradition to other great world traditions. C. A passion for learning. D. An interest in communicating that passion to undergraduates. Attendance at conferences must cease to be defined as professional activity. It should be seen for what it is: prestige hunting and long-range job-seeking junkets, meat rack mini vacations. The phrase, "he or she is just a conference hopper," C.F., just a gigolo, must enter the academic vocabulary. I look for the day when conference hopping leads to denial of employment or promotion on the grounds that it is a neglect of professional duties to scholarship and one's institution. Energies have to be reinvested at home. The reform of education will be achieved when we all stay put and cultivate our own garden, instead of gallivanting around the globe like migrating grackles. Furthermore, excessive contact with other academics is toxic to scholarship. Reading and writing academic books and seeing academics every day at work are more than enough exposure to academe. The best thing for scholars is contact with non-academics, with other ways of thinking and seeing the world. Most of the absurdities of women's studies and French theory would have been prevented by close observation of ordinary life outside the university. There should be more flow between the university and society. Politicians, businessmen, soldiers, artists, engineers, scientists should be brought in for regular visits and an exchange of views. Instead of schmoozing with other academics at conferences, faculty should be required to do outreach work via general interest community lectures at public schools, libraries, and churches. A sense of the general audience must be recovered. All literary criticism should be accessible to the literate general reader. That there is such a general audience, which has been arrogantly blocked out by obscurantist theorists, laughably claiming leftist and populist aims. I know from letters I have received about my own book, literature and art are never created for scholars, but for a universal audience. If academics cannot see that audience, they cannot see art. Students are the nascent general readers among us. The post-war, publish or perish tyranny must end. The profession has become obsessed with quantity rather than quality. At top universities, 2 published books are becoming the minimum, even for an associate professorship. Burger King now rules the waves. 1 brilliant article should outweigh 1 mediocre book. Real contributions to knowledge take time. Scholarly time is very slow. Right now, young academics are caught in a bind which pits scholarly integrity against their economic self-interest, particularly if they are responsible for children. Scholarship is a life of study leading to a mature production of the mind. Completed chapters of a substantial ongoing project, submitted to outside review, should be acceptable for employment or promotion. Rushing people into print right after grad school just leads to portentous fakery, which no one reads anyhow. Maynard Mack was already saying in 1969 to our graduate seminar that, quote, 95% of what is published in any given year should be ritually burned at the end of that year. The pressure on shaky novices to sound important and authoritative makes for guano mountains of dull rubbish. Good writing and teaching require a creative sense of play. In American academe, as opposed to Great Britain, playfulness and humor, as well I know, are suspect, suggesting you aren't, quote, serious enough. But comedy is a sign of balanced perspective on life and thought. Humorlessness should be grounds for dismissal. Eccentric individualism, in the style of the old German scholars, must be tolerated. Teachers should not be conformist clones. Graduate students must be encouraged to let their personalities flower in the classroom. Teaching is a performance art. A feeling or respect for the past is the great gift we can bequeath to our students, trapped in the busy, bright, brazen present. Even leftist professors these days lack a sense of history. Arguments against the canon have come suspiciously often from banal, uncultivated careerists who, whatever their current prominence, lack scholarly distinction. Individual authors or works may go in and out of favor. Both Shakespeare and Bach had to be revived by Romanticism. But the overall line of Western culture will never change. Every woman, Black or Oriental raised, and writing in English is a product of that main line. The piddling ignoramuses who deny there is a distinct, discernible, objective Western tradition are just woozy literati. That line is absolutely concretely manifest in the visual arts. At the temple complex of King Zoser at Saqqara are the papyrus-capped pillar forms invented by Imhotep, which would be transmitted to us by Greece and Rome. Freshmen from the poorest neighborhoods are amazed to discover that, cresting the columns of Philadelphia banks, churches, museums, libraries, and civic buildings, are the fronds and curls of Egyptian plant life in 4,500 years of historical memory. The whole racial argument about the canon falls to nothing when it is seen that the origins of Greek Apollonianism were in Egypt, in Africa. Go down, Moses. Even Judeo-Christianity sojourned in Egypt. The freshman year should be entirely devoted to basic science, biology and geology, and to ancient world history and art, up to the early Middle Ages and the birth of Islam. Sophomore year coverage would extend from the High Middle Ages and Renaissance to the present. In the first year, comparative religion would allow the social science and humanities faculties to fuse their instruction. The sacred texts of all major world religions would be studied, beginning with the Bible, knowledge of which has disastrously eroded. Students adore paleontology and archaeology, which, particularly in its underwater branch, brings together science, history, and art. Artifacts, monuments, and sacred sites and rituals from European, African, Far and Near Eastern, pre-Columbian, Native American, and oceanic cultures would be closely studied. The method would be rigorously old historicist. There would be no melodramatic victimage scenarios, that drippy amateur soap opera which fuzzy academic liberals, suppressing recognition of their own innate aggression, aggressively project backwards. The human record is virtually universally one of cruelty barely overcome and restrained by civilization. Imperialism and slavery are no white male monopoly, but are everywhere, from Egypt, Assyria, and Persia to India, China, and Japan. Current events should be systematically but sparingly worked into the ancient picture by teachers. For example, I like to show freshmen the elegant Arch of Titus in the Roman Forum. There, in the bas-relief of the great menorah being carried from the temple by Roman soldiers at the sack of Jerusalem and Diaspora, we see the beginnings of the political problems that still seethe in the Mideast. Modernization means westernization. The modern technological world is the product of the Greco-Roman line of mathematics, science, and analytic thought. The academic pops politicos, pandering to students, rob them of their future. Education must simultaneously explore and explain the world's multiculturalism while preparing the young to enter the Apollonian command system. But ethnic descendants should, as much as possible, retain their creative duality. I feel Italian but love America. Oprah Winfrey shifts wonderfully back and forth, with jazz-like improvisation, between her two voices. African Americans must study the language and structure of Western public power while still preserving their cultural identity, which has had world impact on the arts. We must expose the absurdity of our literary ostriches who think we need the death-by-sludge French theorists to tell us about multiple discourses. The established scholarship of comparative religion, anthropology, and art history had already prepared us with a flexible, accurate methodology for negotiating among belief systems and identifying the iconography and symbol schemes of different cultures and periods. I call for an immediate end to undergraduate theory of criticism courses, which force pastel hangers on people who have no clothes yet. Such courses should be reconstituted by less trendy faculty, as history of aesthetics, to take in all world art forms, including dance, which has to be rescued from the physical education department and given its true eminence. The Greek organic triad, archaic, high classic, Hellenistic, is the paradigm for the study of style. Just as the rise, flowering, and decline of Rome, so lavishly well documented, is the paradigm for the study of politics. Classicism trains the eye. Knowledge of it is essential for artists and for everyone who claims to be interested in art. The simplicity, clarity, and proportion of classicism remain major principles of architecture and theater and opera sets, and they profoundly inspired important fashion designers like Chanel, Adrian, and Halston. The mythic pattern of Western culture is Greek revival. Again and again, objects are lost and refound, overvalued, devalued, then revalued, but the classics always return. Naturally, tastes may vary from person to person. I myself think Auntie Mame the best novel since World War II, and I infinitely prefer Antony and Cleopatra to King Lear, which puts me to sleep, except in its campy opening scene. But I also recognize that no one in the world can claim to be educated without knowing King Lear. The real marginalizers are the panderers, who would condemn our students to perpetual second-class status. Great works of art have their own life and will outlast us. We hold these things in trust. Academe should be a savings and not a spendthrift institution. Like public museums, universities are essentially conservative, curatorial. Yes, artworks seem to shift from generation to generation, but it is the mercurial gleaming of Proteus, the metamorphosis of imagination. It is up to us to choose the works best suited to enter the dream life of our students, works that will retain their value and give the best return over time, lasting sources of consolation and enlightenment. In the predatory go-go era of quick turnover junk bonds and windfall profits, there has been no interest in long-term investment of time and energy by either faculty or students. Tired of literature and piqued by au courant linguistics? Why, just binge and purge with Saussure. Swallow him whole, then vomit him out. Don't bother doing the real work that linguistics requires painstaking mastery of ancient and modern world languages. The theory years were pure sloth, a pig rut of pretension and megalomania. In this disgraceful academic scandal, we have people dismissing science and psychology who know nothing of science or psychology, people spouting politics who know nothing of political science or history, people claiming to do anthropology who know nothing of anthropology, people throwing around philosophical terms who know nothing of philosophy. For the first time ever, we have pedantry without learning. The spiritual vacuum of recent academe is responsible for the popularity of false teachers like the mushy Joseph Campbell, who gives people the long view of traditional mythology, and for the spread of New Age mysticism, whose hoaxer channelers satisfy the craving for ancestral voices. We need back-to-basics reform on every level of education. Old German philology was culture criticism at its learned, comprehensive best. Let us put an end to the yuppie buffet, the designer drugs and watered-down, piss-poor Molotov cocktails served with crudités and French canapés, hot now, stale later. Perhaps the French flunkies should leave academe and form their own associations like the Shriners, where they can moon over their idols and exchange photos like bubblegum cards. There are precedents for this in the cults of Swedenborg and Madame Blavatsky. Enough already of Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault poured like ketchup over everything. Lacan, the French fog machine, a gray flannel worrybone for toothless academic pups, a twerpy, cape-twirling Dracula dragging his flocking stooges to the crypt. Lacan is a Freud t-shirt shrunk down to the teeny-weeny Saussure torso. The entire school of Saussure, including Levi Strauss, write the muffled prose of people with cotton wool wrapped around their heads. They're like walking Q-tips. Derrida, a gloomy Gus one-trick pony stuck on a rhetorical trope already available in the varied armory of new criticism. Derrida's method, masturbation without pleasure. It's a bird-brain game for birdseed steaks. Neo-Foucaultian New Historicism, a high-wax bowling alley where you score points just by knocking the pins down. Hey, fellas, there's something out there that electrocutes people on beaches, collapses buildings like cardboard, and drowns ships and villages. It's called nature. The next time the western horizon flames with crimson, remember that this is what Foucault never saw. Foucault was struck down by the elemental force he repressed and edited out of his system. Science, disdained by Foucaultians, is our only hope for controlling the retrovirus and marauding infections of AIDS. Science and society are our frail barriers against the turbulence of cruel, indifferent nature. How does the mind work? This is the psychedelic question. Sensation, perception, emotion, memory, dream, imagination. French theory is hopelessly inadequate for explaining art and life. An American psychedelic criticism would see through and disrupt, while also intensifying and enhancing. Teachers who assign Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault to unprepared students are fools. There is so much else to learn and know. The French fad is now a skeleton wreck. 70 years of the school of Saussure are crowded onto a solitary ice floe. As we steam by or fly overhead, we should simply say to our students, "Look, my child, there on that wandering island heaped with bones is where the Saussurian sirens sang, and where so many lost their lives and careers." A word-drunk profession driven by conferences and cronyism turns itself into a seething herd of lemmings, weasels, and coy duodog acts at MLA or on the road. Women's studies is institutionalized sexism. It too must go. Gender studies is no alternative. Gender is now a biased, prudish code word for social constructionism. Sexology is an old and distinguished field. As sex studies, frankly admitting it is sex we are tirelessly interested in, it would take in the 100-year history of international commentary on sex. It would make science its keystone, and it would allow both men and women as well as heterosexuals and homosexuals to work together in the fruitful dialogue of dislike, disagreement, and debate, the tension, confrontation, and dialectic that lead to truth. Women's studies is a comfy, chummy morass of unchallenged groupthink. It is, with rare exception, totally unscholarly. Academic feminists have silenced men and dissenting women. Sunk in a cocoon of smug complacency, they are blind to their own cliched Rousseauist ideology. Feminists are always boasting of their diversity and pluralism. This is like white Protestants in the 19th and pre-60s, 20th centuries, when they controlled American politics, finance, and academe, claiming diversity on the basis of their dozens of denominations. But blacks, Jews, and Italian Catholics, standing on the outside, could clearly see the monolithic homogeneity that the WASP insiders were blissfully, arrogantly unaware of. If any field ever deserved a punishing Foucaultian analysis, it's women's studies, which is a prisoner of its own feudal, grinding, self-created discourse. Women's studies needed a syllabus, and so invented a canon overnight. It puffed up clunky, mundane contemporary women authors into Oz-like skywriting dirigibles. Our best women students are being force-fed an appalling diet of cant, drivel, and malarkey. Pioneering work in sex studies will come only from men and women conservatively trained in high-level intellectual history. American feminism's nosedive began when Kate Millett, that imploding beanbag of poisonous self-pity, declared Freud a sexist. Trying to build a sex theory without studying Freud, women have made nothing but mud pies. In Great Britain and France, feminists did not make this silly mistake, but unfortunately their understanding of Freud has been tainted by the swindling Lacan. Now the missing but indispensable Freud is being smuggled back into America by the Lacan feminists with their paralyzing puritanism. It's all ass backwards. Just read Freud, for pity's sake, and forget Lacan. It's outrageous that women undergraduates are being made to read Lacan, who haven't read Freud, and therefore have no idea what Lacan is doing. Freud is one of the major thinkers in world history. One reads him not for his conclusions, which were always tentative and in process, but for the bold play of his speculative intelligence. He shows you how to conceptualize, how to frame long, overarching arguments, how to verbalize ambiguous, nonverbal psychic phenomena. Reading him, you feel new tracks being cut in your brain. Cheap jibes about Freud, epidemic in women's studies, are a symptom of emotional juvenility. American feminists, sniveling about Freud without reading him, have sentenced themselves and their work to mediocrity and irrelevance. Simone de Beauvoir's brilliant, imperious The Second Sex, now 40 years old, is the only thing undergraduate sex studies needs. Add Freud to de Beauvoir, and you have intellectual training at its best. The later French women choking the current syllabus don't come up to Simone de Beauvoir's ankle bones. That damp sob sister, Hélène Cixous, with her diarrhea prose, or Lucie Irigaray, the pompous lapdog of Parisian café despots doing her grim sledgehammer elephant walk through small points. American feminism is awash with soupy Campbellism. Schlockmeisters like Maria Gimbutas, the Pollyanna of poppycock, with her mommy goddess tales conveniently exalting her Lithuanian ancestors into world-class saintly pacifists. The chirpy warblers, Gilbert Gubar, those unlearned, unreadable bores, with their garbled, rumbling, hollow, rolling trashcan style. Carolyn Halebrun, Mrs. 50's tea table, who spent her academic time, while my generation was breaking its head against social and sexual convention, spinning daydreams about a WASP persona, Amanda Cross, and who spoke out only when it was safe to do so. Heilbrun's late self-packaging as a feminist is a triumph of American commerce. The gauzy, ethnicity-evading style of her dazzlingly research-free books is the height of wishful, reactionary gentility. Women's studies is a jumble of vulgarians, bunglers, whiners, French fanatics, apparatchiks, dough-faced party-liners, pie-in-the-sky utopianists, and bullying, sanctimonious sermonizers. Reasonable, moderate feminists hang back and, like good Germans, keep silent in the face of fascism. For 15 years, the established women academics irresponsibly let women's studies spread uncritiqued and unchecked. I call this period, quote, while Wendler slept. Great women scholars like Jane Harrison and Gisela Richter were produced by the intellectual discipline of the masculine classical tradition, not by the wishy-washy sentimentalism of clingy, all-forgiving sisterhood, from which no first-rate book has yet emerged. Every year, feminists provide more and more evidence for the old charge that women can neither think nor write. Most current academic leftism is specious because post-60s liberalism is moribund. My anti-liberal position should not be mistaken. For conservatism, I am radically pro-pornography, pro-prostitution, pro-abortion, and pro-legalization of drugs. The leftist attack on the traditional Western canon has primarily come from politically weak thinkers who are the product of English departments. Genuine Marxism, which I respect, requires accurate observation and rigorous economic analysis of present social conditions. The academic leftists merely parrot outworn formulas and slogans from the pre-war era. It's a literary game without the deep conviction of personal sacrifice. Gerald Graff's professing literature is most interesting and well-written when it is on the firm ground of the birth, development, and decline of new criticism. But Graff's account of 19th century classical education is appallingly deficient, full of coarse bias, selective use of evidence, and elementary errors in historical reasoning. Its major problem is its failure to consider in due detail the cultural transition from 18th century neoclassicism to Romanticism in its several 19th century phases. Graff's presentation of classics as dry, dead, and pointless is pure propaganda. Richard Oman and Terry Eagleton are clear, vigorous, combative writers whom I take seriously and enjoy reading, even when I strongly disagree with their facts and conclusions. Both are good examples of the Marxism that isn't. Their picture of the contemporary world simply shows they do not live in it. Oman notes that he entered college in 1948, a year after I was born. He has no understanding of the way mass media formed the imagination of my post-war generation. Protesting, quote, the tyrannies of this culture, he urges us to overturn, quote, bourgeois culture and the rule of our dominant classes. Condescension and paternalism mar his hoary, stereotypical portrait of the poor, passive, quote, powerless proletariat, helplessly manipulated by the ruling class, the managerial oppressors coldly wielding their awful brainwashing tool, the media. Oman is snobbishly scornful of the actual tastes of the very people he claims to speak for. Pop culture is mass culture. The people live in it and through it. By the electric nerve reflex of commerce, television vividly speaks their thoughts and dreams, and with their own confident, aggressive energy, which so overwhelms and confuses bookish academics. Through mass media, African Americans have revolutionized the arts and taken over the world stage. Oman's passing remark about Italians made my blood boil. His insulting, maudlin picture of the embarrassed Italian immigrant, cowering in a World War I-era Shakespeare class, and, because of, quote, invincible ignorance, condemned to the humiliation of being a laundress or parking attendant, shows just how delusional ivory tower leftism gets. The Italians I know came here from 1895 to 1935, gung-ho for education. From Cincinnatus through Renaissance, artisans to the present, Italians have believed in the nobility of physical labor. Working-class people, unlike academics, love cars and like to be around them. Laundry has a huge positive symbolism in Mediterranean culture, visible as early as Homer's Nausicaa episode, and strikingly evident in stories from my family heritage. I could go on and on. Academic Marxism is a fantasy world, an unctuous compassion sweepstakes, into which real workers or peasants never penetrate. Terry Eagleton is a deft, witty summarizer of other people's ideas. Applied Marxism is, oddly, his weakest point. He also goes limply soft on academic feminism, whose bourgeois prudery, moralism, and Protestant word fetishism he does not see. Eagleton's thought-provoking arguments against the canon are unfortunately vitiated by the fact he seems to have little feeling for art. Is education to be gutted merely because Terry Eagleton wandered into a profession for which he discovered too late that he had minimal talent? Like Foucault, Eagleton continues to push into one new field after another, restlessly searching for success in something. He has certainly been successful in convincing literary critics that he is a Marxist. Sociologists and political scientists might think otherwise. The signal failure of the academic Marxists is in their obliviousness to the transformations of modern labor. In the age of mass media, power has shifted its meaning and loci. Capitalism, whatever its problems, remains the most efficient economic mechanism yet devised to bring the highest quality of life to the greatest number. Because I have studied the past, I know that in America and under capitalism, I am the freest woman in history. Unionized blue-collar jobs now routinely pay higher salaries than are earned by most teachers. Physical labor, as a concrete skill occupation, is free of the soul-destroying office politics suffered by the Marxists' demonized managerial class, who take their jobs home with them and are in a continual funk of anxiety and neurosis. Performance assessment at the top, as in academe, is a murky mire of words, gossip, connections, stroking, conspiracy, backstabbing. Unharried weekend leisure time is the center of working-class American life in ways the academic Marxists, resentfully marking papers and endlessly pressed for time, simply don't see. I have no idea what Eagleton's jobs were before Oxford, but while Oman was attending conferences and enjoying his tenure, received, he admits, before he became a Marxist, I was making ends meet by teaching Sophocles and Shakespeare to warmly receptive black and white factory workers in on-site night classes at the Sikorsky aircraft plant a half-hour away. So much for the irrelevance of the canon. The Marxists fail to see the simple, archaic conservatism of the working class, as well as the endurance, worldwide, of its warrior code, an individual ethic related to athletics, of courage, honor, and stoicism. Academic Marxism, based on neither observation nor experience, has turned into cocktail chat for the carriage trade. I now address the graduate students. This is a time of enormous opportunity for you. There is an ossified political establishment of invested self-interest. Conformism and empty pieties dominate academe. Rebel. Do not read Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault, and treat as insignificant nothings those that still prate of them. You need no contemporaries to interpret the present for you. Born here, alive now, you are modernity. You are the living link between the past and future. Charge yourself with the high ideal of scholarship, connecting you to Alexandria and to the devoted, distinguished scholars who came before you. When you build on learning, you build on rock. You become greater by a humility toward great things. Let your work follow its own organic rhythm. Seek no material return from it, and it will reward you with spiritual gold. Hate dogma. Shun careerists. If you keep the faith, the gods may give you, at midlife, the sweet pleasure of seeing the hotshots, who were so fast out of the gate, begin to flag and sink, just as your studies are reaching their point of maturation. Among the many important messages coming from African American culture is this, from a hit song by Midnight Star: "No parking, baby, no parking on the dance floor." All of civilized life is a dance, a fiction. You must learn the steps without becoming enslaved by them. Sitting out the dance is not an option. The children of the 60s have returned. 20 years have passed, and many of us, through folly, hubris, or mischance, have died or been left sleeping in the land of the lotus eaters. The palace has been taken over by shallow upstarts, raiding and wasting the treasury laid up by so many noble generations. It's time to clean house.